Hi everyone. So I don't have my headphones on, just because I don't, I don't want to. So if you're gonna talk, I can't hear you. You have to tell me in the chat. So we have 10 people here, and we'll see how many we get next week. But essentially, all I wanted to do was give you the opportunity for the last 40 minutes here. Maybe we'll use all of it. Maybe we'll use some of it to throw any assignment 3 related questions your way. Yeah, that's really about it. So if you kind of have some questions about it, obviously, like I can't debug your code in the lecture, but if you feel there are big conceptual questions or anything like that, then please just share them in the chat, and we'll keep doing that until we hit 8 o'clock or until we run out of questions, whichever one comes first. Nope, we lost another one. Great. Okay, first question. How to going to URL link without token 2.3.1. Okay, so 2.3.1 is starting a game. Let me just share my screen so that you can see what I'm talking about. Okay. God, I haven't used Zoom in so long. Gosh. That one. Yeah. Okay, I think this is good. Great. So 2.3.1 says this. So basically you click start game and there's a pop-up that shows the session ID of the game as a string. And then it says this session ID, I should say ID, I'm sorry. I'm gonna just change that very quickly now, because otherwise I'll forget. README, yeah. So this session idea, idea, perfect. The session ID should be able to be copied by some kind of copy link button or element. When this item is clicked, a direct URL is copied to the clipboard. When going to this URL, the user should be given a play screen. So, I mean, if I'm understanding your question, which is like how to go into a URL without token. So basically, your app is kind of going to consist of two major parts, right? Which is the big part, which is the admin panel, where you create a game, modify a game, start a game, advance a game, finish a game, and all that, log in, register. And then the second part, which is the play part, which is all of 2.4, which is, just one section. There is no sense of token or anything like that in these cases. Basically, you end up on a web page, you put in the session ID, and then you're playing the game. I think if this game was more advanced, and maybe I'll add this as a advanced feature for next time, if they were to refresh the page, they'd still be playing. But I think the way this is described is such that a player lands on a web page, they put in a session ID, you're obviously going to make a backend call, and then they just keep playing, but there's no sense of actual real sessions or cookies or local storage. You know what I mean? Like if they refresh the page, they fall out of the game. If they refresh the page halfway through, they fall out. I don't think I stipulated anything like that. Does that answer your question? So which URL should I generate? I tried play join, but that doesn't work. Well, it's your own, right? Like you have to, I've seen a few students get confused by this. It's like you have your routes on your React app, and then you have your routes on your server. They're two totally different things. So just because the server has a play join route, that's just an API. It's not a web page. All of the pages that you're creating are your pages, you know, from scratch. So you can call it whatever you want. I think we just say to you, it has to be a unique route to join. Yeah, it's totally up to you. Same with the other pages, like all these ones up here with starting a game and all of that. It's totally up to you. May I use a button to go to that page? Well, as is expressed here, the button is to copy something. So like, it's a little bit like, you know, maybe you'll get a referral code from someone or something like that, and you copy it, right? You click a button to copy the link, to like share it with someone, like when you copy a Google Doc. That's all the button is doing. And then in the real world, you would take that link and give it to a friend or give it to your students or something like that. And then they would all use that link on their own browsers to connect. Again, a very similar thing to Kahoot. I don't know if you have played Kahoot actually yet. If you haven't, I would say you should, because this stuff would be really hard to understand without it. But if you have, then that's the best answer I have for you. Yeah, you just define it in React Router with a wildcard, just like some of the other pages. How do you check if if the answer is right or wrong after playing? Sure, that's a good question. How would you check that? Okay, so, well, I just have to start up the backend. So give me all of 10 seconds. So, I mean, as an admin, how do you check the answer is right or wrong after playing? Well, the results endpoints will tell you that, right? So if you're an admin and you get the results, then for each answer, so like here's a list of players, right? And then each player has a list of answers, and then each answer will say whether it's correct or not. So as an admin, that's how it says correct or false. And as a player, you just get a list of questions, right? So, I mean, these two data structures are the same, because as an admin, you get the results for a player, but you get to see all the players. As a player, you just get your results. The question of how again, this comes back to how does the backend know that it's correct? And this is where the custom.js file comes into play, because on your front end, you've got a custom data structure, right? Like you've got this questions data structure that's a list of things that might have IDs and thumbnails and answers and just all this kind of stuff in it. And this is where you would need to fill out the question.js file, a custom, .js, because what the backend does is it actually uses these functions to determine what the correct answer is. So it takes in one of your questions, right? Because the data structure you provide here is a list of questions, right? So it takes in whatever this data structure is you've provided here. And this function takes that data structure and it returns the answers and the correct answers, right? So if you implement these two, then that is how the backend determines it. So the backend gives you the results, whether they're right or wrong. That's all done for you. how does the backend determine whether it should be true or false for each of those questions? It uses these functions, which are stubbed with dummy data, but you would implement. And I just want to stress again, this question argument that it takes in all of these cases is this little empty object here that you obviously populate with something more meaningful, because this questions parameter is a list of stuff, right? So it's 1, 2, 5, 10, 20 stuff. And that stuff has a structure that you define. So this function takes in your structure and it expects you to decode it. It's basically a mapping function, right? Like the backend just needs to be like, here is an abstract data type that I don't understand how it's implemented. I'm going to give that to you, and this custom data function will give me what I want, which in the first case is what can be shared with players. The second case is what are the correct answers for that question. The third one is what are all the answers for that question. The fourth one is how long is that question in seconds to complete. Yes, this is a function that the backend uses, and it applies it to any question it wants. It's how it can decode your custom question structure and make sense of it. For those of you who are quiet and don't have any questions tonight, if you don't mind me asking, how are you going with the with the assignment? Just generally, are people finding it okay? Difficult, easy, boring, fun? Any of those adjectives will do. Bit hard? Yeah, it is a bit hard. I have to say, I think that so last term was kind of tricky because I wanted it to be a group assignment, but I didn't want to force people to have to work together because I think that's challenging for when you're learning a new language and things. So I made it optionally a group. And I felt really bad because, some students wanted to be alone, but then they basically had to work twice as hard or whatever, right? So this term we made it harder. I would say that it's about 25% harder physically, like just in terms of the time it takes. I think one element though that's very relevant for groups is that when you work in a group on this thing, we do expect group members to work like approximately equally, which means they actually have to coordinate really well, and coordinating is a big challenge in itself. So the general theory is that working in a group will require less physical coding per person naturally, but it will probably involve the same amount of time in terms of just sunk into it. Because there will be some groups like some pairs here that like the way of them programming is that they both program together and they both commit on the same machine and stuff. But again, like we're going to be looking at commits and stuff. So if people are in a group and they get a free ride, they're going to get a really low mark. So I think it's hard for individual. I wouldn't feel, beaten down about it for sure. But it's a hard assignment, it's the third of the course. So but it's fun. Do you feel like people feel like you're learning stuff? Do you feel like has anyone been enjoying React after, like, what have been people's experience with like using React after assignment two? Like, there's parts of React that are more difficult to work with and parts are easier. Are people feeling that? Like some things are like, I wish I could just do this manually, and other times you're like, wow, that was really easy to use. Hong Tao says not only need to know more about use effect, use state, use ref, use reducer, but also need to use some UI DOMs. I mean, I don't really use ref or use reducer at all, to be honest. Some of the UI components are definitely a challenge for sure. I think that's definitely one part of it. They're also hard because there really is like Bootstrap is generally a pretty good library, because I think battling with themes is one really hard thing. Like I've seen some students say, oh, I'm going to use like a whole component library theme that's like does so much for me. But then what happens is every time they want to change something, they're like bashing their head against the wall for hours because they can't, control it. I mean, that's the standard. That's life in abstractions, right? Like React's like that. React's quicker 90% of the time until you want to do something that you think is quite simple. And you're just like, how the hell do I do that with React? Go says contexting and related design decisions a little hard and confusing. Yeah, I've been very, very particular not to turn this into a design or product course because we don't teach enough. We don't have enough space to teach it effectively. And that's kind of what courses like 3.5 and 4.5.1.1 are for. But usually the marks we expect for UI UX are a lot of it's meant to be very common sense stuff in terms of like, we're always hoping students build things that are not terrible more than good. Like no tutor marks this really and thinks like to get 10 out of 10, it needs to be like beautiful, like a designer made it. But, we usually hope to have people apply some common sense. And we like to teach a couple of tips and tricks. Like I think on the usability UI UX front, the lecture number 1, the one that Sparky did, the first one, that's probably the best, where he talks about some colors and other things, because white space, just some of those tips. It's pretty simple. Zishuan says, could you show a little demo for generate URL and go into that URL? I mean, so I do hate answering questions like this, but we have actually gone through this before. I don't, off the top of my head, remember where. I feel like it might have been week 7 or week 8, but like we talked about React Router, which was where we defined routes. Like we went through this example where we based, or if it wasn't one of those, if you've seen both of those and it's not that one, then it's going to be tutorial 8, which was where we had the tutorial question about it. So just to avoid repeating myself, that's kind of where to look. But React Router, it's basically, where's some wildcard stuff? Yeah, it's like here. Like it's like literally this example here on, I clicked on React Router, I clicked on web, I went down to like the bottom of the page, and it's this, these functions here. It's when you're using the route path with like, oh wait, did I go too far? No, that was good. Yeah, it's in the other lectures and stuff, but it's basically where you're using the route from React Router, but you give it a wildcard with the colon. I think we did that for user ID in one of the last couple of lectures. You're going to hear this again from me probably at the end of the course or next week. So I'm sorry for those who've turned up or listened today. But one of the things that I want to stress is, and I made this big point to another course somewhere, or maybe in the course outline, is that this is a practical course, like a really hands-on course. And there's a strange side effect from that I think. And like on one end of the spectrum, you have courses like this, and on the other end of the spectrum, you have courses that are quick but hard. And an example is like when you go to a maths exam, right? It's very possible for you to answer all these hard questions, to think you got them right, but to actually get them wrong. And the way I've described this to people is that there are lots of exams out there, like maths exams, where the gap between finishing the work and getting the work right is actually really big, right? Like think about all those exams you've done where you finish the exam, like you've been like, yep, good, finished it, and you've like done terribly. One of the challenges with a course like this is that when we give you assessments like this, we're actually kind of giving you the solutions at the start. We're telling you exactly what like you need. You can just either get there or not, right? Like it's really simple. You either have like you can either edit your game or you can't. You can either start your game or you can't. You can either see the results or you can't. And what that means is that for courses like this, the gap between finishing and getting it right is really small. And it's pretty much just your interpretation of the spec. That's all it is. It's just that tiny gap. And what that means is that in other types of courses where you want all the students to generally finish, but all of them to have a different result, it's challenging in this course because typically speaking, if you finish this assignment, if you do it all, you've gotten 100% roughly, right? Again, you're going to make mistakes you don't realize, and there'll be misinterpretations, but generally speaking, you'll do very, very well. So what that leads us to is basically we have to write assignments that are hard to finish and that we don't expect people to finish. Because if we write assignments that most people will finish, or hell, even half of you will finish, then half of you are going to get an HD, and that's like not educationally responsible, right? So I don't know if I mentioned that at any other point in the course. I don't think so, but don't feel disillusioned or lacking in confidence when we give you these big things to do, because the only reason they're big is because doing half of it would generally mean you get half the marks, which is different to kind of other types of things. So, like in a course like 2521, where you're mainly getting tested on like, write this sort, but then they give you all these tons of edge cases and you get like 10%, even though you like think you finished it. Whereas like here, it's like the way the tutors mark it is they're like, okay, I'm going to load up your app. All right, login screen says /login. Yep, there's an email and a password field, tick. I'm going to type in an incorrect one. Yeah, there's an error message. Oh, I click the submit button and it takes me somewhere like tick, 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 tick. That's how they mark it, right? So we have to, by nature, make this a challenging thing to actually finish. Otherwise, everyone gets 100%. Anyway, thanks for listening to my babble. I mean, the same thing we always say to students too, which is like, for many of you 8 or 9 weeks ago, you didn't really know anything. And it's incredible that in a period of 9 weeks, right, that you can build web apps. It's kind of wild, so there's a lot of courses out there where you definitely finish them and you're like, well, why did I do that? So anyway, any other questions? I was just killing time because you don't have any. There we go. Do we always need to encapsulate all data processing into an object when dealing with data? What do you mean by that? I'm not sure what you mean by that. Sorry, Hongtao. Are you asking like when you create a functional component? Is your question again, do we always need to encapsulate all data processing into an object when dealing with data? Are you asking like when you do stuff with React, do you always need to put your code inside the functional component, or can you put it like above it? Is that what you're asking? So I'm just going to hope I understand your question. In general, the way I try and approach React stuff is that if you have extra logic, extra functions and stuff, you should always try and keep that outside of your functional component. But in many cases, if you try and do that, you'll get a compilation error because a lot of functions that are written for functional components will generally require, like, they'll generally want access to the state variables and props and stuff. You know what I mean? So it's like, if your function has to be inside your functional component, then put it in there. And if it doesn't, put it outside of it. And it's good practice even. This is not something that you get marked on, but like, it's good practice to put your functions outside of your functional component if you can, because that helps other programmers understand that this function is not part of your component. Like, it's independent. It can be reused elsewhere. Do I need to use all APIs to finish the assignment? Again, when you say finish, I'm going to interpret that like do everything we asked. What ones don't you think you need? I'm curious. I made this really simple. Like I wrote this in the middle of term in T3, so I was not in the mood to create unnecessary routes, but I'm curious what you think you don't need. You found player ID in questions not very useful. I honestly don't know how to answer that, because you'd have to tell me which API routes you don't need, because like you need these to display quizzes, you need these to get new quizzes. No, tutors won't look at the APIs you use. They'll run your backend, but they're not going to check if you use APIs. You cannot use them if you think. I'm just genuinely like I'd be a little surprised if you actually don't need it, and I'd be kind of worried that maybe you're doing something wrong, if that makes sense. And maybe you're not. Maybe you're either doing something very right or something very wrong. Is kind of how I'd say for that. I don't know. Yeah. Any other questions? Again, I can happily tell you whether you need the API calls if you tell me the particular ones you're referring to, but outside of that, I'll just say do your best. In assignment 2, there's a database called something .sqlite, but in assignment 3, I just find database.json. Assignment 2 has a very complex backend. It was written by people with Flask and SQLite databases. I wrote assignment 3 backend with the intention of it being extremely simple, which means that there's no dummy data to start with, and all of the data is stored in a JSON file rather than SQLite database, which from memory, I don't know how that works. I can't remember how it saves to the database though. Update. Okay, update's called unsave, and save is called when it crashes. And when else? Huh, I don't know. Save data. Save data. Is that a different file? Where is it? I wrote this thing. Database file. Yeah, but I'm just like curious when it saves. Because I can see that it updates. Save calls update, reset updates it to nothing. Yeah, so reset just removes the file. When save is called, that looks like that's actually what updates it to the file. And save is called only there. Sure, it's used somewhere else. Yeah, it's just I thought I'm just trying to figure out when it actually writes to the file, because I thought it did it every time the route's called. Yeah, but like sure, we write to the file here, right? That's when we save the state of your application to a file. But that only happens when we call update, and we only seem to call update as part of the save function or as part of reset, and reset wipes it. So I'm only interested in save, and then the only place I can find save function is basically if on the initial load of the server, it fails to load your file, save is just called to essentially write the database file. Basically, this is what happens the first time it's called. Is it tries to load your JSON file, but it doesn't exist. So then it saves an empty file. And the variables are populated to be blank. That's so weird. Oh, it's in this file, is it? Oh, sure. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Duh. Basically, pretty much all these functions here, all the route functions are wrapped in a first class function called catch errors. So every single route takes in a function. So this is the actual function that executes, and it gets passed into catch errors. And what catch errors basically does is it calls the underlying function. And then as soon as it's called it, it saves the file, which I just realized that should probably be awaited, but it's not. Because technically save just returns a promise. Yeah, that should definitely be awaited. It's not a big deal though, because the lock takes care of it. Because everything in JavaScript's asynchronous, right? You kind of have to lock this so that it doesn't. Well, you could lose. It's okay. And then if there's an error, it basically checks what the error type is, and it returns a relevant 400, 403, or 500. Yeah, very simple. Not a lot to this program. Any other questions? There's actually tests for the backend as well. They're all written here. They're all written in Jest. Pretty simple tests. This wasn't super thorough. This was actually, to be honest with you, the tests are mainly there to prevent regression, as in like when people need to make a change. Like when people are like, oh, can you update the backend? Well, this doesn't happen anymore, but people are like, can you update the backend? And then yarn test will look for all the .test files, just like React, right? Like yarn test just calls Jest, and Jest doesn't care if it's React or Node, whatever. It just runs it. It just so happens that the stuff we've taught you with React requires those extra libraries. Yeah, it runs. I think does the server need to run? I think the server needs to run. Does it? No, it doesn't. Yeah. There must be some code I wrote here that like starts the server up. Oh yeah, server.close. That's probably it. Import the server and then, yeah. Send a request to the server. That's interesting. Yeah, so there's all these tests that run. Writing servers in, like, if you're a student who has written something in Flask or Django in Python, I would strongly encourage you the next time you write a backend server to write it with Node.js. It is substantially more pleasant to write web servers in Node. Not to mention, like, it's not just nicer because JavaScript's kind of, in a way, designed to be asynchronous. But you can also do some crazy cool things with JavaScript. Like, you can import files. Like, if you have a backend and a front end folder here, you can like actually import a file from the front end. And I think that's actually done somewhere from memory in config, or maybe config.json here, right? 510. See how like in the front end folder inside source, there's a file here called config.json. In the actual backend folder server, I hope I import it. Maybe I'm crazy. Yeah, look right here. Now, sorry, this is a bad example because you could do this with Flask. Like, it's just a JSON file. That's why JSON exists, right? So you can transfer things between languages. But the point is you can actually import JavaScript. So if you write a function you like, you can just write it in a folder and import it in a backend and import it in a front end, and they'll both use it, which is very powerful. So it starts to allow you to build unified code bases pretty easily. Okay, any other questions? Otherwise, we'll wrap it up because you're all getting pretty quiet. I'll send out a notice on the weekend, but a reminder: Monday night we have a guest lecture from Canva. It's more a marketing lecture. It's from someone in, well, marketing is the wrong word. It's from someone in HR, as opposed to Zane, who's an engineer. And Thursday's lecture next week's the exam. So both are recorded, but yeah. And I'll hang around on Monday night too if people have assignment 3 questions. So okay, well, thank you everyone. I'll wrap it up there. There is no HR person from Google. The reason that there's an HR person from Canva is because like Canva use a lot of JavaScript. I definitely wouldn't go and say like Canva are like better at JavaScript per se. I'm not saying they're not either. But it's just all of what they do, right? So a company like Google looks at a course like this and it's like, okay, great, but maybe 5-10% of our employees use JavaScript. I don't know, some small number. Well, I don't know what the number is, but they're a massive company, right? And Canva's a tiny company comparatively. So pretty much all they do is JavaScript. So they obviously see a course like 6080 and they're like, ooh, that's helpful. So that's why you get someone from HR coming on. I'm sure and then you obviously seen a bunch of Canva engineers already doing the pre-recorded lectures. Okay, thanks everyone. Have a great night, and I'll see you on Monday.